Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today and for joining the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies for today's Innovative Mobility webinar. We're honored and pleased to be joined today by Professor Martin Wachs, who's going to be providing an update about the California Road Charge Pilot Program. My name is Madeline Brosen. I'm Associate Director for External Affairs here at UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and I'm thrilled to be the host for today's webinar. Before we get started, let me provide you a brief overview for today's program. Professor Wachs is going to be presenting information about why we need to explore road charges compared to our traditional system of motor fuel taxes. He'll provide a background about the federal government's involvement in these demonstration projects across the country, and then walk through the California program. He's going to detail the schedule for the program and its evaluation, and talk about the who, where, and what types of vehicles are participating, as well as give a preview of the types of perspective that'll be included in the final report. Following his presentation, I'm going to kick off the question and answer portion of today's webinar, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. As you see on the YouTube screen, to the right of the video window, you're going to see a chat window, and that's where you can put in your questions for Professor Wachs at any time, and we'll collect them all at the end, and I will be moderating that Q&A. You do need to be signed in to a Google account to use this feature, so I encourage you to go ahead and get that set up now. We're excited to use YouTube for today's event, as the video will be available directly at the conclusion, so if there's anyone who wasn't able to join live, you can send them this link, and they'll be able to view today's program. With that overview, let me introduce today's speaker. Professor Martin Wachs is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning. He's the author of over 150 articles and 4 books related to the relationships between transportation, land use, and air quality, and the use of performance measurement in transportation planning and policy. Currently, Professor Wachs is actively working on research relating to transportation finance and is also active in public policy. He's currently chairing the design competition for the new Port Authority bus terminal in New York. He's a member of the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group. And today he's going to be presenting information relating to his role on the California Road Charge Technical Advisory Committee. With that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and hand the controls over to Professor Wachs.
Thank you very much, Maddie. And in addition to being a member of the Technical Advisory Committee that advises Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission on the Road Charge Pilot Program, I'm also a participant in the program. So my wife and I each have a car, and we're both signed up as participants. So our experience has also been as part of the program itself, getting bills every month and so on. And I'll explain how it works as we go on. I'm trying to advance the slides, and I thought I would press the right arrow, and it's not advancing. Let me try. Nope, it's not advancing. Sorry. I hear footsteps. Okay.
Just a moment as we're getting this settled. Thank you very much for your patience.
There we go. Okay, thank you. So the first question, of course, is why would we explore a road charge? The gasoline tax has been the principal way of raising revenue for transportation programs over nearly 100 years. And why do we need to move forward with a new strategy for raising funds? First of all, of course, the need is great. I think most people who have signed on to this webinar would agree that we are suffering from an aging infrastructure. And while we might even argue that capital investment in new infrastructure is very, very important, I think most of us would agree that the maintenance and operations of our existing infrastructure are very, very important and are very resource intensive, and we need more financing of it. But at the very same time that we have an aging infrastructure, especially in places like California, where the quality of the road surface is really deteriorating quite steadily over time, there's shrinking funding. The motor fuel tax is raising less and less revenue. And in a few places, there are also toll programs. But basically, we've not raised the principal source of funding for transportation, the motor fuel tax, for decades in many states and at the federal level for multiple decades. We're placing increased requirements on the transportation system. For example, increased environmental review processes that cost more to implement regional planning, greenhouse gas reduction programs, and we're not raising consequently, concomitantly with that, we're not raising the revenue that we need to address all of those concerns. And very importantly, fuel efficiency is increasing for a variety of very good reasons, like greenhouse gas reduction. And we have the federal guidelines say that within a few years we're going to get to the point where we're supposed to average 55 miles per gallon. And obviously, if the fuel charge is based on a per gallon tax, an excise tax based on per gallon sold, the only way we can raise more revenue using the existing fuel tax is either to raise the tax per gallon, which is politically a serious problem, or we can increase the consumption of fuel, but that's counter to our policy goals. So the idea of moving to a road charge that is not based on fuel consumption has several roots. One is that it would free us from this link between raising more money by using more fuel in an environment in which policy is telling us we want to use less and less fuel. And the other is, of course, that unless we raise the per gallon rate, which has been proven politically difficult, the fuel tax has a limited life, probably not a very short limited life. That is, the fuel tax can continue to produce substantial revenue for the next 20, 30 years maybe, but in the long run, if we have vehicles that are powered by hydrogen, powered by electricity, a petroleum-based fuel tax won't work. But on the other hand, the motor fuel tax is actually very attractive as a way of raising funds for transportation programs, and it has been successful for 100 years. One of the reasons it's very attractive is that there's very, very low administrative costs. The tax is actually collected at a small number of wholesale outlets when the fuel is loaded onto trailer trucks for delivery to gas stations, and then it's eventually passed on to retailers. The fuel is dyed when the tax is paid, so you can determine when you purchase fuel, the orangey yellow kind of color of the fuel is the result of dye that's inserted. You can tell that the fuel tax has already been paid. And while there is a history of evasion of the fuel tax, the proportion of the tax that is lost to evasion is really small compared with many other taxes. So it's easy to administer, it's low cost, and it's relatively evasion proof. That all places us upon us a burden that whatever we replace it with has to be efficient, has to be resistant to evasion, has to function at a relatively low cost, and that's a huge challenge. In addition, in principle, we have used the motor fuel tax as a user fee rather than as a tax, in that the money that it produces is put into separate trust funds from the rest of the general budget and is therefore used only to benefit those who pay the fees in principle. So for highway maintenance, for the expansion of the highway network, and over time that principle has been flexible so that we also use, for example, a proportion of the motor fuel tax to subsidize public transit on the grounds that the traveler who pays the fee also benefits by improvements to public transit, because especially at the most congested locations, transit provides an alternative and reduces traffic congestion. So this last point, the revenue being deposited into separate trust funds, could be carried forward into a new program in which user fees are employed. In fact, if you go back to the 1920s when the motor fuel tax was first used, many of the debates about employing a motor fuel tax included arguments that if at some future date a more perfect user fee could be developed and the motor fuel tax could be abandoned in place of a more direct user fee, that would be an attractive feature that people actually wrote about and talked about in the 1920s and 30s as states were adopting the motor fuel tax. But for example, the motor fuel tax isn't charged at the time and place that you make a trip. It's charged at the time and place that you fill up your tank. And a mileage-based user fee could actually be levied at the time of day, at the particular facility, and even by the class of vehicle. And it gives us the opportunity to, quote, in quotation marks, perfect the mileage, the concept of a user fee by making the use and the fee more directly linked than they are with a motor fuel tax. Now, I think everybody on this call is pretty much aware that vehicle miles of travel are growing and are expected to continue to grow. And despite a downturn that some people thought might be permanent, that was associated with the 2008-9 decline in the economy, vehicle miles of travel growth has resumed pretty much as on the path that it was on prior to the economic downturn. And at the same time, fuel consumption is decreasing because we are introducing some electric vehicles, very tiny numbers of hydrogen-powered vehicles, but mostly it's declining because the miles per gallon rating of the vehicles that we have, even though they are internal combustion engines, are increasing each year in accordance with federal requirements and state requirements. And here in California especially, there's an aggressive program to increase vehicle fuel efficiency in order to achieve greenhouse gas goals. Now, this slide and the next one are drawn from a wonderful report that I've read a number of times and recommend. It's by Asha Weinstein Agrawal, Hillary Nixon, and Ashley Hooper from San Jose State University. They did a synthesis of a very broad literature on user perceptions, public perceptions of mileage-based user fees. And they came up with 7 or 8 major conclusions that I'm simply going to restate here. And these 2 slides come from their work. First, they concluded that there's relatively little research on what the public thinks about paying directly mileage-based user fees, and therefore there's of course value in collecting more high-quality data about what the public thinks. And one of the goals of the California program is to see how it sits with people who are experiencing it, 5,000 or so people who were part of the trial. Another conclusion is from the literature that they reviewed, which included focus groups and surveys and newspaper articles and editorials and so on, a very broad review. They found that there's actually very low support for mileage-based user fees. And as a person who's researched this over the last year or 2 or 3, I certainly agree with that. But it's also true that what we find is that what people initially, when they're told about the possibility that they could pay for the use of a road by a direct charge, a monthly bill, something for their use of the road when driving, it is very unpopular. 50, 80, 90%, depending on which survey, of people say this is a really bad idea when they first hear about it. But what we learned from this literature review that Asha and her colleagues did is that as people become more familiar with the concept, they become more favorable. So another reason for the California trial is to familiarize people with it and familiarize legislators with it so that people, because we know that as people try it, they actually like it better than they do when they first hear about it and have not been exposed to it. We have found across the whole world, and there are mileage-based user fees in use in a number of countries, 7 or 8 countries, including New Zealand and Croatia, and for trucks in Germany and in many other places. We know that there's higher support among people who have used it than among people who haven't. So the idea of a pilot survey is in part public relations. It's to familiarize the public with an unfamiliar concept. People object to the perceived complexity. That is, you pay the gas tax, you drive into a gas station, you say, you know, $20 on pump 7, and your gas tax is included. You don't even notice it. In this case, it would be more complex, and you'd have to get a monthly bill. It would have to be linked to a credit card or something like that. Public opinion is against that because of the complexity. So, and very important concerns repeatedly found in the literature. People worry about privacy. Is the government really going to know where I'm traveling and why, or from which origin to which destination? They worry about fairness. People raise the concern, well, if I live in the rural area, I have to drive more miles than if I live in an urban area. It turns out actually that I've done research on rural versus urban, and it turns out that the people who would benefit more from a mileage-based fee are the rural travelers, because in addition to driving more miles, they also drive less fuel-efficient vehicles than urban vehicles. That is, Priuses and Teslas and so on are concentrated in urban areas, and pickup trucks are concentrated in rural areas. So by moving to a flat mileage-based user fee, you would actually be benefiting rural travelers more, but their opinion is different. The attitudinal research shows something different. People are concerned about billing errors, incorrect charges. They're concerned that if we eliminated the motor fuel tax, there would be less of an incentive, which I think is absolutely true, to purchase more fuel-efficient vehicles, and there would have to be other incentives provided. People are concerned about the hardship of having to pay, let's say, a monthly bill, as opposed to paying pennies or a few dozen pennies maybe on a fill-up at a gas pump. But the key benefits or that people recognize in sort of focus groups and surveys are that there would have to be a correction for the fact that very fuel-efficient vehicles are paying less to use the roads, even though they impose costs similar to those of less fuel-efficient vehicles, which today are bearing an increasing burden for paying the motor fuel tax. I think it's fair to say, before launching into a description of the California program, the last point is that public opinion is that most people would prefer 5 cents more, 10 cents more in the gas tax than switching to a mileage-based user fee. And in the short run, that may be more publicly acceptable. So an exploration of mileage-based user fees should be thought of as part of a transition that might stretch over 20 years or 30 years even. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. We're looking at a new concept, not necessarily for immediate implementation. The FAST Act, signed by President Obama in the last days of his presidency in December of 2015, actually provided $95 million to assist state demonstrations. And Caltrans, California, actually applied for one of those and received it to follow on with, that is, the presentation I'm about to summarize. The current program that I'm about to summarize is nearing completion, and they received a grant for the next steps would be to integrate a mileage-based user fee with the charges for gas taxes by having the gasoline pump, when you drive into the gas station, cancel your gasoline tax and charge instead the fee based upon how much you've driven since your last fill up. And of course that would have to be extended to other sources for electric vehicles which don't go drive into a gasoline station, and the follow-up study would address that question. But others, you see here listed 7 or 8 other trials that each received $300,000, $500,000, $1 million to begin work on mileage-based user fees. And so you see that it's actually quite a national program. And in particular, at the bottom, you see the Western User Charge Consortium. It's a consortium of several states that includes California. So Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado are also part of a collaborative effort to do things together, because of course vehicles cross state lines, and a similar technology, a similar program across state lines would be a very, very important thing to do. So now for the specifics of the California program. In the year 2014, the California legislature, both houses, passed, and and the governor signed a bill called Senate Bill 1077. It was originated in the Senate. And it created a road charge technical advisory committee of about 15 people, of which I am a member. It specified that they had to be drawn from different interest groups, and the particular interest group that it specified, it said it had to include a transportation researcher, and that's the line that I fill. But it also includes representatives of poverty organizations, of privacy-related organizations. It includes a couple of state legislators. It includes representatives of the trucking industry, and organizations that represent, for example, the Chamber of Commerce. So it's quite a diverse group. And we began meeting monthly during the year of 2015. We gathered public input. We addressed in long debates privacy and data security issues. And we were required by the legislation to include in the options for the people participating in the trial that there would be at least one non-technology option. Technology means, GPS, following your vehicle to estimate your mileage traveled. A non-technology option might be a sticker that's placed on the windshield that you have paid for 5,000 miles or 10,000 miles of driving, and that's a very simple one, and it has been used in other parts of the world. And then there are options in between, like simply reading the odometer at some fixed facility periodically, quarterly or something like that, and charging based upon miles traveled. That's another low-tech, let's call it, option. So this pilot test of a variety of options was planned at first to begin in January of 2017, early this year. And the governor actually asked that it be accelerated, and it actually did begin in July of 2016, and will end at the end of this month, at the end of March of 2017. And a report to the legislature on the findings is now due in July of 2017 instead of June 2018, which was initially specified in the legislation. So you see that this is a high priority, at least in terms of its timing. It doesn't mean the legislature will enact a mileage-based user fee after the pilot is completed, but they did ask for, the governor urged a speeding up of the process, and that has happened, and the program is ahead of schedule according to the original legislative requirements. The pilot project was designed to have 5,000 participating vehicles statewide, and I have to be a little careful here because, remember, vehicles don't express opinions, and participants in the experiment do express opinions. They're actually people. So there's about 5,000 vehicles. Some people operate more than one vehicle, and some vehicles are operated by more than one person. So it's important to distinguish between vehicles and people. There's the pilot project has been underway for 9 months, and in fact, this morning, as a participant, I received an email saying, "Guess what? Your participation will end at the end of this month, and you'll have to send the device in your vehicle back." And so we know it's on schedule to end at the end of March, a few weeks from now. The vehicles include a lot of private vehicles, light-duty vehicles owned by individuals and families and firms, but also commercial vehicles, including some heavy trucks, including mid-range vehicles. It actually does also include a few vehicles, a small number, that operate across state lines that are registered outside of California for the purpose of being certain that we can measure their travel on California roads and account for their travel in-state and out-of-state and credit them for out-of-state travel because we don't want to charge people for traveling on Arizona roads in Arizona registered vehicles. We only want to charge them for their travel in California. The pilot test includes 6 different ways of tracking or reporting your mileage. It has 10 data security features built into it. It's actually very hard in a trial, in a pilot test, to examine the possibility of fraud. TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, actually considered encouraging hacking and violations, but if there's no real charge being levied, we get a simulated bill each month, and we make a simulated payment with a simulated credit card. If there's no real money to be realized through fraud, it's very hard to actually test fraud literally, but there are attempts being made to hack the system and violate privacy for the sake of determining how secure it is. But those are simulations rather than real trials of actual hacking. The independent evaluation. There is a separate contractor engaged for the sake of evaluating the program from the contractors who were involved in designing the program. Those designing it were not allowed to compete for the role of the independent evaluation. So the project schedule is as shown here. Phase 1 and Phase 2 are completed. Phase 3 is underway, but will end at the end of this month. So the pilot design has been done. The evaluation criteria have been designed. They are available to anyone listening into this by going to the website of the California Road Charge Pilot Program. The long report, it's 100 pages or more, plus appendices, will fill you in on all of the evaluation criteria. The pre-pilot programming, planning, the recruitment of participants, all of that was done during Phase 2. Phase 3 is underway. We went live in July in the sense that people who had volunteered on the roughly 5,000 people started participating. Their mileage started being tracked or accounted for via a low-tech option. And then that phase of the study is being completed right now. As a participant, I filled out a very long questionnaire this month, which will be part of the evaluation. Certainly not the only part of the evaluation. The technical success of the contractors operating the pilot is also being evaluated. So between April and July, the evaluation consultant will be writing its report and reporting to the legislature. So up to this point, and these data are current as of last week. I actually got them yesterday from Caltrans. 27,205,000 miles have been tracked by the 5,000 participants in this program over a 9-month period. There are 5,000 or so participating vehicles. The vast majority, about 4,500, are private vehicles. 55 heavy trucks have been tracked, and 258 light commercial vehicles, 2-axle trucks. There are 6 different reporting methods, but 81% of the people who volunteer to participate in the program are actually using some kind of an automated method where GPS or the telemetry in their vehicles, in newer vehicles, or smartphones are being used to track their travel. And 19% are using the manual means of reporting their mileage. So this data, I should mention very briefly that the vehicle totals shown here are not exactly the same as on the previous slide, because these data are a little bit older. These are from September, and the data I showed just on the previous slide is from last week. These have not been updated, but they're almost the same. They're not precisely the same, and the reason for that is that some vehicles dropped out of the trial and others were added, especially where there were shortages in some categories of vehicle that were added relatively recently. But in general, these data are correct, and they show that 91% of the vehicles were private vehicles, 4.8% light commercial vehicles, heavy commercial vehicles are 1%, and other, including out-of-state vehicles and vehicles that are not easily classified, are about 3%. And the right panel shows that the North in California is perhaps overrepresented, and that may reflect the fact that Sacramento, the state capital, is in the North, and awareness and knowledge of it is stronger in the northern counties in the Bay Area. 14% of the participants are from Central California, which is more rural in nature, and 38% are from Southern California. And then there are out-of-state vehicles registered in Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, but a relatively small number of those participating. The mileage reporting methods that could have been chosen, that were chosen, remember that the high-tech options on the right represent the most common choices by the participants in the trial. By the way, the trial was advertised by the Auto Club. It was Auto Club magazine encouraged their members to sign up. It was advertised in public service announcements on television stations. It was mentioned in newspapers, and it was clearly promoted on websites of the California Transportation Commission, the California Department of Transportation, the Air Resources Board, and so on. So the sources of the volunteers were very varied, but we somehow got a slight bias toward participants in Northern California. The high-tech items include a plug-in device, which is the one I'm using. I have a device from Azuga, which went into the OBD2 port under the steering column in both of the cars that are in my household that are participating in the program, and that's the most common choice. But other people have chosen a smartphone app. Of course, your smartphone has to be on when driving the car in order for that to work. And others chose the vehicle telemetrics that are already in the newer cars and are built into the vehicle itself. A few people chose a time permit, which is what I mentioned before. You buy 5,000 miles, or you buy, which is the mileage permit, or you buy the right to drive on California roads for 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. The time and mileage permits are the lowest tech options. And then an intermediate one is to have your odometer read at a specific location quarterly. And incidentally, the odometer reading one resulted in some people dropping out of the program because they had to drive so far, especially if they lived in rural areas, to go have their odometer checked. And it was an annoyance. And so more people dropped out who had opted for that option than some of the other options. But there are still people participating who have the odometer option. So this is the enrollment of the private vehicles, the 4,500 vehicles by option, and you see that 82% chose automated methods. And to me, the interesting thing about that is that people say, I don't want the government tracking my driving. I don't want people to know where I drive. I don't want GPS following my vehicle. And then they pretty readily sign up for the options which do track their vehicles and present those threats. So it turns out that people are less objectionable, are less objecting to these kinds of technologies once they actually sign up for things than they do in the abstract when the concept is described. And that is an important reason for having a trial. But 18% did sign up and are continuing at this moment. About 18% of the participants are using these stickers on the windshield or odometer readings as an alternative. Azuga, the device that I mentioned, in the one that I'm using, is almost 60% of the participants. Other contractors are using other technologies. DriveSync is using vehicle telemetrics, and the manual ones it's actually a consultant that's operating it, but it's doing so in the name of the state of California. As I already mentioned, the North is overrepresented a little bit in comparison with the concentration of vehicles in California. The South is a little bit underrepresented. And one reason for the change in the numbers of vehicles participating is that even as the program advanced after July 1st, there was an effort made to enroll more vehicles in the South in order to address that balance, and it was moderately successful. So you see that 50% of the commercial vehicles, 45% of the private vehicles are in the northern part of the state. 11% are in rural and agricultural areas, and 87% are urban and suburban. And 86% are standard internal combustion engines, 11% are hybrid vehicles, and 3% are electric vehicles. And of course, some households, individuals, may own more than one vehicle, and it can be an internal combustion engine and a hybrid vehicle in the same household. And when they respond to surveys, they report on different vehicles. Of course, the people expressing opinions are the people, not the vehicles. What I find really interesting is that the vehicles most commonly represented is the Toyota Prius. And while many vehicles, as you see here, the Ford pickup truck, F-150s, Honda Civic, Honda represents the most common manufacturer of vehicles represented in the 5,000 vehicles in the program. The Prius is the #1 vehicle, and that's a Toyota, and it's a plug-in hybrids are included within the Prius category. The Prius is the most fuel-efficient vehicle, and you would think that the Prius owners would have the most to lose by changing from a motor fuel-based tax to a mileage-based fee. And I think what this represents is that people who are knowledgeable and environmentalists are the most interested in participating in such a program. It's more about their high levels of education, their commitment to environments, their awareness of public policy, than it is about their ability to win or lose by shifting from a motor fuel tax to a mileage-based user fee. The top participating hybrids are also the Toyota Prius and hybrids and electric vehicles, but there are 48 Chevy Volts and other makes and models as well. 273 Toyota Priuses are participating. It's a substantial number. And to complement something I just said, about 2/3 of the people participating in this program, who are all volunteers, earn above the median household income for the state of California, 20% below, and 14% didn't tell us their income or preferred not to state their income. And again, by age, the most common age group is the 18 to 45 years old, and a substantial number of 46 to 65-year-olds, and a smaller number of those who chose not to disclose, 10%, but a smaller number of those over 65 also. So this is quite, the participants, in other words, are quite typical of the driving public in the state of California, at least in terms of their age. And by gender, the sample is to a greater extent male than female, and 8% chose not to disclose their gender, so we don't know what it is. But again, males are overrepresented in comparison with the general driving public in California. So as the program proceeded, the participants in the project, the volunteers, have been sent a monthly newsletter electronically. You don't have to have an email account to participate. Some of the manual methods, the stickers on the windshield and the odometer readings, a small number of those people don't have electronic accounts and are mailed monthly newsletters, but the vast majority of people are getting information by monthly newsletters. They also are invited to look at the website. When I receive a monthly newsletter, it also, I can log on at any time and monitor what they have seen, how much driving I've done on each vehicle each day. And it also gives me a weekly update. It says, your device in the vehicle has reported a mechanical problem or no mechanical problems, or your battery is below standard charge levels and you should have it checked. I get updates of that sort as a participant in the program. So the part of this is to benefit the participants by giving them more and more information. But there's also monthly newsletters sent to interest groups who are not participating, and there are actually thousands of those. The website is updated continually, and there have been tens of thousands of people inquiring of the website. So the final report, which is underway, the second survey, an interim survey, and then the final survey was just done this month. The final report will be based upon those surveys, based upon measured participation, and will report on data security, privacy, the differential impact on rural versus urban, the effectiveness of tracking vehicles within the state of California and outside the state of California. And the report will be quite comprehensive and will go to the legislature. The legislature has no obligation to engage in any activity beyond reading the report, and it's not necessarily the case that every legislator, of course, will read it. It'll be a public document. It'll be available in June, and it'll contribute to the continuing debate and understanding of mileage-based user fees. And it also will be an input to the next phase of the California program, which involves the use of a federal grant and the development of partnerships with other states to try to move forward the process of implementing a mileage-based user fee. And the first is to try to explore this possibility of making it simple, by having it related to motor fuel purchases, or in the case of electric vehicles, to charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, charging, that is, charging the electricity as well as charging the fee. So I'm pretty much at the end of my description of the program, and at this point we'll see if the technology works, and people online can have been, I hope, sending some questions, and we will hear them from Maddie, and I'll try to be responsive. I hope some of them are comments as well as questions. Maddie?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Marty. This was an extremely helpful overview that really helped to explain who's participating in the program and walk us through a lot of the kind of common questions I think that many people have. We don't have any questions on the line right now, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with a couple. But I'd like to encourage our 40-something viewers to provide your comments and questions in the chat window to the right of the screen. So, Marty, the first question is to think about the behaviors that this program might actually change, or if we would expect to see those as well. So, if one goal of the program is revenue, what do we do about the fact that charging by the mile could provide an incentive to drive less? And the follow-up to that is, if revenue is generated per mile, do agencies have an actual incentive to encourage driving?
The architecture of charging by the mile and the architecture of charging by the gallon both require the state to periodically change the rate that we charge. So you have to change the tax per gallon from time to time in order to get more revenue over time to meet our needs. But similarly, you might well have to change the per mile charge. And my response to the question is that you don't necessarily improve the situation that you described by changing from one architecture to another. You have to change the rate, whether you charge by the gallon or you charge by the mile. But what happens when you move to a shift to charging by the mile is that you could charge by the mile different rates at different times of day and encourage congestion pricing, and thereby encourage people to move some of their travel out of the peak times, or recover the higher costs of peak travel through a mileage charge when travel, especially the automated forms, when travel is being tracked in some way by a GPS system. And you could use it to charge more, for example, on a high-cost facility and less on a low-cost rural road. And you could actually build into the fee a higher fee for a less fuel-efficient vehicle if you wanted policy to reflect that. And the benefit of the mileage-based fee is its flexibility. You could do all of those things, which would require a policy intervention at the state level. And right now, the state legislature is not interested in any of those. The legislation that created the pilot program said it has to be a flat fee on all roads at all times on all vehicles, exactly the same, because they were more interested in simplicity than in that subtlety. But those of us who are looking forward 20 and 30 years into the future, think that it could actually be a device for making the charge system more reflective and therefore influencing travel. So if you want to influence travel, as you suggested, by getting people out of the peak and into the off-peak, by moving less essential travel to the off-peak, that could be included in a mileage-based fee, and it cannot be included in a per-gallon gasoline tax. But I do want to be careful that I don't overstate. That's in the long term. It's not under consideration right now.
Thank you. That's a really helpful kind of explanation to say, right now it's very straightforward, and that we have the potential going forward to really actually use a lot of these levers to shift travel and behavior towards kind of a more optimized system. So we are actually getting a number of questions coming through now. So the first one is wondering if you knew about the dropout rate of the program. You did mention that there's been some fluctuation in the number of cars. What percentage of people that originally signed up are still in the program?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. And I didn't mention one aspect of the program that relates to that question. We began on July 1st of 2016, and in September, people could switch from a manual to an automated system, from a cell phone system to a GPS-based system of like the Azuga device inserted that I'm using. And about 85% of the people, when given the option of switching, stuck with what they had started with. The people who have dropped out of the program, it's measured in dozens as opposed to thousands of participants. And the incentive, by the way, for staying in the program is very small. At the end of the program, at the end of this month, the participants are eligible for a $50 payment for staying in the program from July to March, 9 months. And the state is making that payment available. It's a modest incentive. It's hard for me to believe that people stay in for 9 months for the possibility of getting $50. But the dropout rate has been surprisingly small, and it's been primarily among people who would have to drive to a mileage checking facility, basically a smog check facility at which their odometer would be read. And it's basically among rural participants who have many miles to drive to such a facility, and they decided that that was too intrusive. But there are small technical issues. Some people signed up, and after 3 months, it was noted that they had done no driving. They went, they changed their plans, and they went overseas on a job assignment or something like that. So the dropout rate is not because of discouragement with the program as much as it is sort of the normal aspects of life. Somebody gets ill, somebody moves out of state, and they've dropped out, and the only dropout that we can identify as associated with the program is associated with this reading of the odometer.
Oh, great. That's really helpful to know. Then hopefully that bodes well for future, that if we make this simple, really easy to participate in the future, if we have this, it sounds like there could be likely to be a positive public reception.
Yes, and I should also add that the mid-course survey showed a very high level of satisfaction. People said they didn't have any problems. I actually had one small technical problem where it was recording for one of my vehicles 0 miles traveled, and when I knew I was driving. So I called the helpline, and they corrected it, and they did so pretty quickly. So most people at the mid-course assessment, a very large percentage said it was going smoothly, and they had no interest in changing to a different recording system. So I would say public opinion, at least, among the participants is very positive.
Great. Do you know if there's any pilot participants who are also taxi or transportation network company drivers, and if there's any representatives of either of these groups that are involved either in the technical advisory committee or just in the program in general?
They have testified before the technical advisory committee at its monthly meetings. During 2016, through the end of 2016, we met monthly. Now that the program is more advanced, we meet quarterly. And they have testified and are following it social network transportation companies are not included among the vehicles.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. So turning a little bit to kind of a broader question relating to transportation finance, do you know if the legislature's appetite for this program has been impacted by any of the current transportation funding bills, which are pursuing a gas tax increase? So kind of, as we're possibly transitioning to a mileage-based user fee, there are some incremental changes that might take place with our traditional, and wondering how those two kind of efforts coincide with each other.
Well, speaking specifically about California, where this trial is underway, members of the legislature, a member of each house, is a member of one member of each house is a member of the technical advisory committee. They are following this very closely, and they're both on the transportation committees of their houses, the Assembly and the Senate. I think that the politics of raising additional revenue for transportation in California right now is still averse to raising the gas tax. I mean, I have testified before the state assembly and found great hostility toward the idea of raising the gas tax. So bills have been introduced. They were introduced last year. They didn't come out of committee, and this year in the new legislative session, it's interesting to note that both SB1 and AB1, the first Assembly bill and the first Senate bill, both relate to increased revenue for transportation, and they're not yet acted upon, but they are both under consideration. And the nature of the debate is more about raising things like the annual vehicle registration fee than it is about raising the motor fuel tax. It remains a very touchy issue. In the end, the depth of the shortage of funds for maintenance and operations in California may lead to a reluctant willingness to raise the motor fuel tax, but right now it's very, very unpopular. So the pilot program report will interest the legislature, but it is important to note that in the short term we're going to have to find other means of raising revenue, because a mileage-based user fee, if it's enacted ever, is many years off.
Turning to the report that we released this summer, there's a question about whether the pilot data will be released to the public along with the report.
Whether what will be released?
Any of the actual data associated with the program will be released to the public.
Yes, I mean the data in terms of miles driven by different classes of vehicles and that sort of thing that was collected, that will be public data, yes.
Oh, great. So yeah, so it sounds like a great opportunity for researchers to also dig into this program as well, which
yes.
From the research community, we're always excited about more data opportunities.
Yes.
Do you think that the travel data for using these plug-in devices could be used for other purposes, for example, like ADT on a roadway, or could just be used for making travel forecasting more accurate?
The answer to that question is clearly yes, and it is already being used. That, for example, data collected by Waze, data collected by INREX is already being used to the extent that it is available to transportation planning agencies. And the answer is clearly yes. The problem, of course, is to make use of such data while protecting individuals' privacy. And that can be done, and it's not actually technically that difficult to do it, but the public concern that if you use their data, if you use individuals' data, you have to anonymize it in some way, is a very real concern. And there has to be a guarantee that privacy is being protected. But transportation agencies are already using such aggregated data, and this would provide further data. I should add to that, one of the things that interests me as a person who studies transportation finance is that the gas tax is, portions of the gas tax are distributed back to counties and metropolitan planning organizations based upon formulas, and the formulas are based on things like the population of the area and the population density or the number of miles of roadway. But you could actually develop a formula in which the funds are distributed back on the basis of actual travel on the roads if you have a monitoring system of this sort in place. So in the future, we could have a much more accurate mechanism for distributing revenues as well as collecting data. And that's another potential benefit of a mileage-based user fee. That doesn't mean the programs are yet popular or likely to be enacted by the legislature, but it's a long-range possibility that makes it the investigation of this possibility more valuable.
Great. So another question is, to what extent do you think the program's benefits to users, information about their vehicle health or their trip info, might attract people who might otherwise be weary of the program due to privacy concerns? I think you talked about that a little bit, but if you want to expand on that at all.
Yes, there's a phrase that's being used in the community of researchers called value-added services, and I think that's what the reference is. If I look at a screen in my vehicle, and it tells me where the nearest motel is, it tells me where the nearest gas station is, it tells me where the nearest restaurant is, it's charging me for my insurance on a per mile traveled, and it's also charging me for the use of the road on a per mile basis. That package of benefits may attract me into the program. The cheaper insurance per mile, or the data on things that are nearby that go with the GPS tracking, may make it more attractive so that I agree to participate in a mileage-based user fee program as part of a package. And it seems even possible that private vendors who offer these services could work with the state to collect the mileage-based user fee. That would help drive the cost down. And one of the important barriers here is to remember that the motor fuel tax costs about 1% of the revenue collected. And right now, the mileage-based user fee might cost as much as 10% of the revenue collected to administer. So this is an important dimension of the program, not only to attract people, but also to drive the per unit cost down.
Do you expect that the program has the potential to make up that gap between in revenues between the traditional gas tax and a vehicle mile fee? If it's a tenfold difference between the collection?
It has the potential. That potential has not yet been realized, and it's important for people to realize that if we were to transition today from a motor fuel tax to a mileage-based user fee, the cost of administration would be higher. And one of the goals of these pilot programs is to try to drive that cost of implementation and administration down. And it's certainly rapidly decreasing. That is, as recently as 3 and 4 years ago, people were reporting 20 and 25% of the revenue consumed in operating the program. And now it's down, people are talking realistically about 7 to 10%. So it's rapidly changing, but it's nowhere near the low cost of administration of the motor fuel tax, which is, again, a reason why many people say, why bother with all this? Why don't you just raise the gas tax a few pennies per gallon? And there's an absolutely valid rationality to that, especially in the short run.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Marty. This was incredibly informative and helpful, and I hope many of our participants agree. With that, we're going to end our webinar today, and thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And remember, you can easily share this link for other people who are not able to attend with us live, and they can get all the updates as well. So thank you very much, and please stay tuned for further webinars from the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies.
Thank you very much.